Naughty 4 o'clocks.
There was some naughty flowers once who were careless in their play. They got their petals torn and soiled as they swung in the dust all day. Then went to bed at 4 o'clock with faces covered tight to keep the fairy drop-a-dew from washing them at night. Poor Drop-a-Dew, what could she do? She said to the fairy queen, I cannot get those 4 o'clocks to keep their faces clean. The mighty Storm King heard the tale, my winds and rain rode he, shall wash those naughty flowers well as flowers all should be. So raindrops came and caught them all before they went to bed and washed those little 4 o'clocks at 3 o'clock instead. And that was written by Laura Ingalls Wilder in April of 1915. Hi, and welcome to the third week of Little House on the Prairie, Storytime with Jocelyn. How are y'all? I think we're going to just go ahead and get on starting with the story. So the last we heard is the Ingalls family moved into the house and the floor and the roof was finished. So they had furniture and beds. Pa did a wonderful job. So today we're going to start with Indians in the house. So let us begin. Right, Jocelyn? Yeah. Early one morning, Pa took his gun and went hunting. He had meant to make the bedspread that day. He had brought in the slabs, and when Ma said she had no meat for dinner, so he stood the slabs against the wall and took down his gun. Jack wanted to go hunting too. His eyes begged Pa to take him. And whines came up from his chest and quivered in his throat till Laura almost cried with him. But Pa chained him to the stable. No, Jack, Pa said. You must stay here and guard the place. Then he said to Mary and Laura, don't let him loose, girls. Poor Jack laid down. It was a disgrace to be chained, and he felt it deeply. He turned his head from Pa and would not watch him going away with the gun on his shoulder. Pa went further and further away till the prairie swallowed him, and he was gone. Laura tried to comfort Jack, but he would not be comforted. The more he thought about the chain, the worse he felt. Laura tried to cheer him up to frisk and play, but he only grew more sullen. Both Mary and Laura felt that they could not leave Jack while he was so unhappy. So all that morning they stayed by the stable. They stroked Jack's smooth, brittled head and scratched around his ears and told him how sorry they were that he must be chained. He lapped their hands a little bit, but he was very sad and angry. His head was on Laura's knee, and she was talking to him when suddenly he stood up and growled a fierce, deep growl. Roar! The hair on his neck stood straight up, and his eyes glared red. Laura was frightened. Jack had never growled at her before. Then she stood over her shoulder where Jack was looking, and she saw 2 naked wild men coming, one behind the other on the Indian trail. Mary, look! She cried. Mary looked and saw them too. They were tall, thin, fierce-looking men. Their skin was brownish red. Their heads seemed to go up to a peak, and the peak was a tuft of hair that stood straight up and ended in feathers. Their eyes were black and steel and glittering like snake eyes. They came closer and closer. Then they went out of sight on the other side of the house. Laura's head turned, and so did Mary's, and they looked at the place where those terrible men would appear when they came past the house. Indians! Mary whispered. Laura was shivering. There was a queer feeling in the middle of her bones, and her legs felt weak. She wanted to sit down, but she stood and looked and waited for those Indians to come out from behind the house. The Indians did not do that. All this time, Jack had been growling. Now he stopped growling and was lunging against the chain. His eyes were red and his lips curled back, and all the hair on his back was bristling. He bounded and bounded clear off the ground, trying to get loose from the chain. Laura was glad that the chain kept him right there with her. "Jack's here," she whispered to Mary. "Jack won't let them hurt us. We'll be safe if we stay close to Jack." "They are in the house," Mary whispered. "They are in the house with Ma and Carrie." Then Laura began to shake all over. She knew she must do something. She did not know what those Indians were doing to Ma and baby Carrie. There was no sound at all from the house. "Oh, what are we going to do? What are they going to do to Ma?" she screamed in a whisper. "Oh, I don't know," Mary whispered. "I'm going to let Jack loose," Laura whispered hoarsely. "Jack will kill them." "Pa said not to," Mary answered. They were too scared to speak out loud. They put their heads together and watched the house and whispered. "He didn't know Indians would come," Laura said. "He said not to let Jack loose." Mary was almost crying. Laura thought of little baby Carrie and Ma shut in the house with those Indians. She said, "I'm going to help Ma." She ran 2 steps and walked a step. Then she turned and flew back to Jack. She clenched him wildly and hung on his strong, panting neck. Jack wouldn't let anything hurt her. "We mustn't leave Ma in there alone," Mary whispered. She stood still and trembled. Mary never could move when she was frightened. Laura hid her face against Jack and held to him tightly. Then she made her arms let go. Her hands balled into fists and her eyes shut tight, and she ran toward the house as fast as she could run. She stumbled and fell down, and her eyes popped open. She was up again and running before she could think. Mary was close behind her. They came to the door. It was open, and they slipped into the house without a sound. The naked wild men stood by the fireplace. Ma was bending over the fire, cooking something. Carrie clung to Ma's skirts with both hands, and her head was hidden in the folds. Laura ran toward Ma, but just as she reached the hearth, she smelled a horribly bad smell, and she looked up at the Indians. Quick as a flash, she ducked behind the long, narrow slab that leaned against the wall. The slab was just wide enough to cover both her eyes if she held her head perfectly still and pressed her nose against the slab. She couldn't see the Indians, and she felt safer, but she couldn't help moving her head just a little so that one eye peeked out and she could see the wild men. Oops. First, she saw their leather moccasins, then their stingy brown legs all the way up around their waist. Each of the Indians wore a leather thong, and the furry skin of a small animal hung down in front. The fur was stripped black and white, and now Laura knew what made that smell. The skins were fresh skunk skins. A knife like Pa's hunting knife and a hatchet like Pa's hatchet were stuck into each skunk skin. The Indians' ribs made little ridges up their bare sides. Their arms were folded on their chests. At last, Laura looked again at their faces, and she dodged quickly behind the slab. Their faces were bold and fierce and terrible. Their black eyes glittered. High on their foreheads and above their ears were hair grows. These wild men had no hair, but on top of their heads, a tuft of hair stood straight up. It was wound around with string, and feathers were stuck in it. When Laura peeked out from behind the slab again, both Indians were looking straight at her, Jocelyn. Her heart jumped into her throat and choked her with its pounding. 2 black eyes glittered down into her eyes. The Indian did not move. Not one muscle of his face moved. Only his eyes shone and sparkled at her. Laura didn't move either. She didn't even breathe. The Indian made 2 short, harsh sounds in his throat. The other Indian made one sound like, "Ha!" Laura hid her eyes behind the slab again. She heard Ma take the cover off the bake oven. She heard the Indians squat down on the hearth. After a while, she heard them eating. Laura peeked and hid and peeked again, while the Indians ate the cornbread that Ma had baked. They ate every morsel of it and even picked up the crumbs from the earth. Ma stood and watched them and stroked baby Carrie's head. Mary stood very close behind Ma and held on to her sleeve. Faintly, Laura heard Jack's chain rattling. Jack was still trying to get loose. When every crumb of the cornbread was gone, the Indians rose up. The skunk smell was stronger when they moved. One of them made harsh sounds in his throat again. Pa looked at him with big eyes. She did not say anything. The Indian turned around and the other Indian turned too, and they rocked across the floor and out through the door. Their feet made no sound at all. Ma signed a long, long sigh. She hugged Laura tight in one arm and Mary tight in the other arm, and through the window they watched those Indians going away, one behind the other, on the dim trail toward the west. Then Ma sat down on the bed and hugged Laura and Mary tighter and trembled. She looked sick. "Do you feel sick, Ma?" Mary asked her. "No," said Ma. "I'm just thankful they're gone." Laura wrinkled her nose and said, "They smell awful." "That was the skunk skins they wore," Ma said. Then they told her how they had left Jack and had come into the house because they were afraid the Indians would hurt her and baby Carrie. Ma said they were her brave little girls. "Now we must get dinner," she said. "Pa will be here soon and we must have dinner ready for him. Mary, bring me some wood. Laura, you may set the table." Ma rolled up her sleeves and washed her hands and mixed cornbread while Mary brought the wood and Laura set the table. She set a tin plate and knife and fork and cup for Pa, and the same for Ma, with Carrie's little tin cup beside Ma's, and she set tin plates and knives and forks for her and Mary, but only their one cup between the plates. Ma made the cornmeal and water into 2 thin loaves, and each shaped in a half circle. She laid the loaves with their straight sides together in the bake oven, and she pressed her hand flat on top of each loaf. Pa always said he did not ask any other sweetening when Ma put the prints of her hands on the loaves. Laura had hardly set the table when Ma was there. He left a big rabbit and 2 prairie hens outside the door and stepped in and laid his gun on its pegs. Laura and Mary ran and clutched him, both talking at once. "What's all this? What's all this?" he said, rumpling their hair. "Indians! So you've seen Indians at last, have you, Laura? I noticed they have a camp in a little valley west of here. Did Indians come to the house, Caroline?" "Yes, Charles, 2 of them," Ma said. "I'm sorry, but they took all your tobacco and they ate a lot of the cornbread. They pointed to the cornmeal and made signs for me to cook some. I was afraid not to." "Oh, Charles, I was afraid." "You did the right thing," Pa told her. "We don't want to make enemies of Indians." Then he said, "Woo, what a smell!" "They wore fresh skunk skins," said Ma. "And that was all they wore. Must have been thick while they were here." Pa said, "It was, Charles. We were short of cornmeal, too." "Oh, well, we'll have enough to hold out a while yet. And our meat is running all over the country. Don't worry, Caroline." "But they took all your tobacco." "Never mind," Pa said. "I'll get along without tobacco so I can make the trip to Independence. The main thing is to be on good terms with the Indians. We don't want to wake up some night with a band of scratching He stopped. Laura dreadfully wanted to know what he was going to say, but Ma's lips were pressed together and she shook a little shake of her head at Pa. "Come on, Mary and Laura," Pa said. "We'll skin that rabbit and dress the prairie hens while that cornbread bakes. Hurry, I'm hungry as a wolf." They sat on the woodpile in the wind and sunshine and watched Pa work with his hunting knife. The big rabbit was shot through the eye, and the prairie hens' heads were shot clean away. They never knew what hit them, Pa said. Laura held the edge of the rabbit skin while Pa's keen knife ripped it off the rabbit meat. "I'll salt this skin and peg it out on the house wall to dry," he said. It will make a nice warm fur cap for some little girl to wear next winter. But Laura could not forget the Indians. She said to Pa that if they had turned Jack loose, he would have eaten those Indians right up. Pa laid down the knife. "Did you girls even think of turning Jack loose?" he asked in a dreadful voice. Laura's head bowed down and she whispered, "Yes, Pa." "After I told you not to?" Pa said in a more dreadful voice. Laura couldn't speak, but Mary choked. "Yes, Pa." For a moment, Pa was silent. He sighed a little long sigh like Ma sighed after the Indians went away. "After this," he said in a terrible voice, "you girls remember always to do as you're told. Don't you even think of disobeying me. Do you hear?" "Yes, Pa," Laura and Mary whispered. "Do you know what would have happened if you had turned Jack loose?" Pa asked. "No, Pa," they whispered. "He would have bitten those Indians," said Pa. "Then they would have been trouble, bad trouble. Do you understand?" "Yes, Pa," they said, but they did not understand. "Would they have killed Jack?" Laura asked. "Yes, and that's not all. You girls remember this. You do as you're told, no matter what happens." "Yes, Pa," Laura said, and Mary said, "Yes, Pa." They were glad they had not turned Jack loose. "Do as you're told," said Pa, "and no harm will come to you." So now that the Indians have visited the house, we now can open 5 more parts of the little house. So now we're going to open another window, number 11, for chapter 11 that we just read about the Indians. And in here is one of my favorite pieces that I got. And it kind of is a little reminder of what Jocelyn has right here. And there is a little card that says, "The true way to live is to enjoy every moment as it passes. And surely it is in the everyday things around us that the beauty of life lies." Laura Ingalls Wilder. And in this little window drawer, we have a beautiful dollhouse quilt. Isn't that gorgeous? Now, back in the day, they would have had something like this that maybe grandma or aunts or even ma would have made to put on their beds for a blanket. And then in this beautiful, I got this that was made, and it's for a dollhouse bed, but isn't it sweet? And that's just a reminder of the beauty that we can find, because sometimes a quilt could be made out of pieces of our life, or pieces of our baby clothes, or pieces of something that may have belonged to somebody that has passed, a loved one. So that is what's in that one, in that window. So now we'll get on to chapter number 12, which is fresh water to drink. Pa had made the bedstead. He had smoothed the oak slabs till there was not a splinter on them. Then he pegged them firmly together. 4 slabs made a box to hold the straw stick. Across the bottom of it, Pa stretched a rope, zigzagged from side to side, and pulled tight. On one end of the bedstead, Pa pegged solidly to the wall in the corner of the house. Only one corner of the bed was not against a wall. At this corner, Pa set up a tall slab. He pegged it to the bedstead, as high as he could reach. He pegged 2 strips of oak to the walls and to the tall slab. He then climbed up on them and pegged the top of the tall slab solidly to the rafter. And on the stripes of oak, he laid a shelf above the bed. "There you are, Caroline," he said. "I can't wait to see it made up," said Ma. "Help me bring in the straw tick." She had held the straw tick that morning. There was no straw on the high prairie, so she had filled it with dry, clean, dead grass. It was hot from the sunshine, and it had a grassy, sweet smell. Pa helped her bring it into the house and laid it in the bedstead. She tucked the sheets in and spread her prettiest patchwork quilt on it. At the head of the bed, she set up a goose feather pillows and spread the pillow shams against them. On each white pillow sham, 2 little birds were outlined with red thread. Then Pa and Ma and Laura and Mary and Carrie stood and looked at the bed. It was a very nice bed. The zigzag rope was softer than the floor to sleep on. The straw tick was plump with the sweet-smelling grass. The quilt laid smooth, and the pretty pillow sham stood up crisply. The shelf was a good place to store things. The whole house had quite an air with such a bed in it. That night, when Ma went to bed, she settled into the crackling straw stick and said to Pa, "I declare, I am so comfortable it's almost sinful." Mary and Laura still slept on the floor, but Pa would make a little bed for them as soon as he could. He had made the big bed, and he had made a stock cupboard and padlocked it, so the Indians could not take all the cornmeal if they came again. Now, if he only could dig a well, then he would make that trip to town. He must dig the well first so that Ma could have water while he was gone. Next morning, he marked a large circle in the grass near the corner of the house. With his spade, he cut the sod inside the circle and lifted it up in large pieces. Then he began to shovel out the earth, digging himself deeper and deeper down. Mary and Laura must not go near the well while Paul was digging. Even when they couldn't see his head anymore, shovelfuls of earth came flying up. At last the spade flew up and fell in the grass. Then Paul jumped. His hands caught hold of the sod, and then one elbow gripped it, and then the other elbow. And with a heave, Paul came rolling out. "I can't throw the dirt out from any deeper," he said. He had to have help now. So he took his gun and rode away on Patty. When he came back, he brought a plump rabbit, and he had traded work with Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott would help him dig this well, and then he would help dig Mr. Scott's well. Ma and Laura and Mary had not seen Mr. and Mrs. Scott. Their house was hidden somewhere in the little valley on the prairie, and Laura had seen the smoke rising from it, but that was all. At sunup next morning, Mr. Scott came, and he was short and stout. His hair was bleached by the sun, and his skin was bright red and scaly. He did not tan, he peeled. "Is this blasted sun and wind?" he said. "Beg your pardon, ma'am, but it's enough to make a saint use strong language. I might as well be a snake the way I keep shedding my skin in this country." Laura liked him. Every morning, as soon as the dishes were washed and the beds made, she ran out to watch Mr. Scott and Pa working at the well. The sunshine was blistering, even the winds were hot, and the prairie grasses were turning yellow. Mary preferred to stay in the house and sew on her patchwork quilt, but Laura liked the fierce light and the sun and the wind, and she couldn't stay away from the well, Jocelyn, but she was not allowed to go near its edge. Pa and Mr. Scott had made a stout windlass. It stood over the well, and 2 buckets hung from it on the ends of the rope. When the windlass was turned, 1 bucket went down into the well, and the other bucket came up. In the morning, Mr. Scott slid down the rope and dug. He filled the buckets with earth almost as fast as Pa could haul them up and empty them. After dinner, Pa slid down the rope into the well, and Mr. Scott hauled up the buckets. Every morning before Pa would let Mr. Scott go down the rope, he set a candle in the bucket and lighted it and lowered it to the bottom. Once Laura peeped over the edge, and she saw the candle brightly burning far down in the dark hole in the ground. Then Pa would say, "Seems to be all right," and he would pull up the bucket and blow out the candle. "That's all foolishness, Ingalls," Mr. Scott said. "The well was all right yesterday." "You can't ever tell," Pa replied. "Better be safe than sorry." Laura did not know what danger Pa was looking for by that candlelight. She did not ask because Pa and Mr. Scott were busy. She meant to ask later, but she forgot. One morning, Mr. Scott came while Pa was eating breakfast. They heard him shout, "Hi, Ingalls! It's sunup! Let's go!" Pa drank his coffee and went out. The windlass began to creak, and Pa began to whistle. Laura and Mary were washing the dishes, and Ma was making the big bed when Pa's whistling stopped. They heard him say, "Scott!" He shouted, "Scott! Scott!" Then he called, "Caroline, come quick!" Mom ran out of the house. Laura ran after her. "Scott's fainted or something down there," Pa said. "I've got to go down after him." "Did you send down the candle?" Ma asked. "No, I thought he had. I asked him if it was all right, and he said it was." Pa cut the empty bucket off the rope and tied the rope firmly to the windlass. Excuse me. "Charles, you can't. You mustn't," Ma said. "Caroline, I've got to." "You can't." "Oh, Charles, no." "I'll make it all right. I won't breathe till I get out. We can't let him die down there." Ma said fiercely, "Laura, keep back." So Laura kept back. She stood against the house and shivered. No, Charles, I can't let you," Ma said. "Get on Patty and go for help." "There isn't time." "Charles, if I can't pull you up, if you kneel over there and I can't pull you up." "Caroline, I've got to," Pa said. He swung into the well. His head slid out of sight down the rope. Ma crouched and shaded her eyes, staring down into the well. All over the prairie meadow, larks were rising, singing, flying straight up into the sky. The wind was blowing warmer, but Laura was cold. Suddenly, Ma jumped up and seized the handle of the windlass. She tugged at it with all her might. The rope strained and the windlass cracked and creaked. Laura thought that Pa had kneeled over and down in the dark bottom of the well, and Mom couldn't pull him up, but the windlass turned a little and then a little more. Pa's hand came up, holding to the rope. His other hand reached above it and took hold of the rope. Then Pa's head came up. His arm held onto the windlass, and then somehow he got to the ground and sat there. The windlass whirled around, and there was a thud deep down in the well. Pa struggled to get up, and Ma said, "Sit still, Charles. Laura, get some water, quick." Laura ran. She came hurrying back, lugging the pail of water. Pa and Ma were both turning to the windlass. The rope slowly wound itself up, and the bucket came up out of the well, and tied to the bucket and the rope was Mr. Scott. His arms and his legs and his head hung and wobbled. His mouth was partly open and his eyes half shut. Pa tugged him onto the grass. Pa rolled him over, and he flopped where he was rolled. Pa felt his wrist and listened at his chest, and then Pa laid down beside him. "He's breathing," Pa said. "He'll be all right in the air. I'm all right, Caroline. I'm plumb tuckered out is all." "Well," Ma scolded, "I should think you would be of all the senseless performances. My goodness gracious. Scaring a body to death. All that for what? And one for a little reasonable care. My goodness, She covered her face with her apron and burst out crying. That was a terrible day. "I don't want a well," Ma sobbed. "It isn't worth it. I won't have you running such risks." Mr. Scott had breathed a kind of gas that stays deep in the ground. It stays at the bottom of wells because it is heavier than the air. It cannot be seen or smelled, but no one can breathe it very long and live. Pa had gone down into that gas to tie Mr. Scott to the rope so that he could be pulled up out of the gas. When Mr. Scott was able, he went home. Before he went, he said to Pa, "You were right about that candle business, Ingalls. I thought it was all foolishness, and I would not bother with it, but I found out my mistake." "Well," said Pa, "where a light can't live, I know I can't, and I like to be safe when I can be. But all's well that ends well." Pa rested a while. He had breathed a little of the gas, and he felt like resting. But that afternoon, he raveled a thread of a low-toe sack, and he took a little powder from his powder horn. He tied the powder to a piece of cloth with one end of the toe string to the powder. "Come along, Laura," he said, "and I'll show you something." They went to the well. Pa lightened the end of the string and waited till the spark was crawling quickly along it. Then he dropped the little bundle into the well. In a minute, they heard a muffled bang, and a puff of smoke came out of the well. "That will bring the gas," Pa said. When the smoke was all gone, he let Laura light the candle and stand beside him while he let it down. All the way down in the dark hole, the little candle kept on burning like a star, Jocelyn. So next day, Pa and Mr. Scott went on digging the well, but they always sent the candle down every morning. There began to be a little water in the well, but it was not enough. The buckets came out full of mud, and Pa and Mr. Scott worked every day in deeper mud. In the mornings when the candle went down, it lighted oozing wet walls, and candlelight sparked in rings over the water when the bucket struck the bottom. Pa stood knee-deep in water and bailed out bucketfuls before he could begin digging in the mud. One day, when he was digging, a loud shout came echoing up. Ma ran out of the house, and Laura ran to the well. "Pull, Scott, pull!" Pa yelled. A swishing, gurgling sound echoed down there. Mr. Scott turned the windlass as fast as he could, and Pa came up, climbing hand over hand up the rope. "I'm blamed if that's not quicksand," Pa gasped as he stepped onto the ground, muddy and dripping. "I was pushing down hard on the spade when all of a sudden it went down, the whole length of the handle, and water came pouring up all around me." "A good 6 feet of this rope's wet," Mr. Scott said, winding it up. "The bucket was full of water. You showed sense in getting out of that hand over hand, Ingalls. That water came up faster than I could pull you out." Then Mr. Scott slapped his thigh and shouted, "I'm blasted if you didn't bring up the spade." Sure enough, Pa had saved his spade. In a little while, the well was almost full of water. A circle of blue sky lay down far down in the ground, and when Laura looked at it, a little girl's head looked up at her. When she waved her hand, a hand on the water's surface waved too. The water was clear and cold and good, and Laura thought she had never tasted anything so good as those long, cold drinks of water. Pa hauled no more stale, warm water from the creek. He built a solid platform over the well and a heavy cover for the hole that let the water bucket through. Laura must never touch that cover, but whenever she and Mary was thirsty, Ma lifted the cover and drew a dripping bucket of cold, fresh water from that well. And that is chapter 12. So now we get to open up another part of the little house, Jocelyn, and it is part number 12. So let's see what we got. Ooh, another part of my favorite scene that we'll learn about later. And the little card says, "As Ma said, it did no good to be impatient." Laura Ingalls Wilder. And ain't that the truth? We should never be impatient for the things that we want, because someday we just might get them. And in this part of the little house, we have a pair of red mittens. Now, these red mittens are very special. They'll go along with another scene that is very favorite of mine. I've talked about this scene for a while. We'll get to it soon enough, but it's my favorite part of the book, favorite part of the pilot movie, A Little House on the Prairie, and the red mittens are very special. So we'll learn about those a lot more later. And that is that part of the house, number 12. Now we're going to go ahead and start reading chapter 13. And ironically, since Jocelyn and I are from Houston, Texas, the next chapter is about Texas Longhorns. So let us begin. One evening, Laura and Pa were sitting on the doorstep. The moon shone over the dark prairie. The winds were still and softly. Pa played his fiddle. He let a last note quiver far, far away until it dissolved in the moonlight. Everything was so beautiful that Laura wanted it to stay so forever, but Pa said it was time for little girls to go to bed. Then Laura heard a strange, low, distant sound. "What's that?" she said. Pa listened. "Cattle, by George," he said. "Must be the cattle herds going north to Fort Dodge." After she was undressed, Laura stood in her nightgown at the window. The air was very still, and not a grass blade rustled. And far away and faint, she could hear that sound. It was almost a rumble and almost a song. "Is that singing, Pa?" she asked. "Yes," Pa said. "The cowboys are singing the cattle to sleep. Now hop into bed, you little scallywag." Laura thought of cattle lying on the dark ground in the moonlight, and of cowboys softly singing lullabies. Next morning, when she ran out of the house, two strange men were sitting on horses by the stable. They were talking to Pa. They were as red as brown as Indians, but their eyes were narrow slits between squinting eyelids. They wore flaps of leather over their legs and spurs and wild brim hats. Handkerchiefs were knotted around their necks and pistols were on their hips. They said, "So long to Pa," and "Hi, yip!" to their horses as they galloped away. "Here's a piece of luck," Pa said to Ma. "Those men were cowboys. They wanted Pa to help them keep the cattle out of the ravines among the bluffs of the creek bottoms. Pa would not charge them any money, but he told them he would take a piece of beef." "How would you like a good piece of beef?" Pa asked. "Oh, Charles," said Ma, and her eyes shone. Pa tied his bigger handkerchief around his neck. He showed Laura how he could pull it over his mouth and nose to keep the dust out. Then he rode Patty west along the Indian Trail till Laura and Mary couldn't see him anymore. All day the hot sun blazed and the hot winds blew, Jocelyn, and the sound of the cattle herds came nearer. It was a faint, mournful sound of cattle lowing. At noon, dusk was blowing along the horizon. Ma said that so many cattle trampled the grasses flat and stirred up dust from the prairie. Pa came riding home at sunset, covered with dust. There was dust in his beard and his hair and on the rims of his eyelids, and dust fell off his clothes. He did not bring any beef because the cattle were not across the creek yet. The cattle went very slowly, eating grass as they went. They had to eat enough grass to be fat when they came to the cities where people ate them. Pa did not talk much that night, and he didn't play the fiddle. He went to bed soon after supper. I think he was tired. Right, Jocelyn? The herds were so near now that Laura could hear them plainly. The mournful sound, lowing sound over the prairie till the night was dark. Then the cattle was quieter and the cowboys began to sing. Their songs were not like lullabies. They were high, lowing, wailing songs like the howling of the wolves. Laura laid awake, listening to the lonely songs, wandering in the night. Further away, real wolves howled. Sometimes the cattle lowed, but the cowboy songs went on, rising and falling and welling away under the moon. When everyone else was asleep, Laura stood softly and to the window, and she saw 3 fires gleaming like red eyes from the dark edge of the land. Over her, the sky was big and still and full of moonlight. The lonely songs seemed to be crying for the moon. They made Laura's throat ache. All the next day, Laura and Mary watched the west. They could hear the faraway bowling of the cattle, and they could see dust up billowing. Sometimes they thinly heard a shrill yell. Suddenly, a dozen long-haired cattle burst out of the prairie, not far from the stable. They had come up from out of the draw, going down to the creek bottoms. Their tails stood up and their fierce horns tossed and their feet pounded the ground. A cowboy on a spotted Mustang galloped madly to get in front of them. He waved his big hat and yelled sharp, high yells. Hi! Yeah, hi! The cattle wailed, clashing their long horns together. With lifted tails it galloped, lumbering away, and behind them the Mustang ran and whirled and ran, herding them together. They all went over a rise of ground and down out of the sight. Laura ran back and forth, waving her sunbonnet and yelling, "Hi! Yeah," till Mom told her to stop. It was not ladylike to yell like that. Laura wished she could be a cowboy. Late that afternoon, 3 riders came out of the west driving one lone cow. One of the riders was Pa on Patty. Slowly they came nearer, and Laura saw that with the cow was a little spotted calf. The cow came lunging and plunging. 2 cowboys rode well apart in front of her. Two ropes around her long horns were fastened to the cowboys' saddles. When the cow lunged with her horns toward either cowboy, and the other cowboy's pony braced its feet and held her. The cow bawled, and the little calf bleated thinner balls. Ma watched from the window while Mary and Laura stood against the house and stared. The cowboys held the cow with their ropes while Pa tied her to the stable, and then they said goodbye to him and rolled away. Mom could not believe that Pa had actually brought home a cow. But it really was their own cow. The calf was too small to travel, Pa said, and the cow would be too thin to sell. So the cowboys had given them to Pa. They had given him the beef too. A big chunk was tied to his saddle horn. Pa and Ma and Mary and Laura and even baby Carrie laughed for joy. Pa always laughed out loud, and his laugh was like great bells ringing. When Pa was pleased, she smiled a gentle smile that made Laura feel warm all over Jocelyn. But now she was laughing because they had a cow. "Give me a bucket, Caroline," said Pa. He was going to milk the cow right away. He took the bucket. He pushed back his hat and he squatted by the cow to milk her. And that cow hunched herself and kicked Pa flat on his back. Pa jumped up and his face was blazing red and his eyes snapped blue sparks. "Now, by the great horn spoon, I'll milk her," he said. He gave his axe and he sharpened 2 stout slabs of oak. He pushed the cow against the stable and he drove those slabs deep into the ground beside her. The cow bawled and the little calf squawked. Pa tied poles firmly to the posts and stuck their ends into the cracks of the stable to make a fence. Now the cow could not move forward or backward or sidewise, but the little calf could nudge its way between its mother and the stable. So the baby calf held safe and stopped bawling. It stood on that side of the cow and drank its supper, and Pa put his hand through the fence and milked from the other side. He got a tin cup, almost full of milk. "We'll try again in the morning," he said. "The poor thing's as wild as a deer, but we'll gentle her and we'll gentle her." The dark was coming on, and nighthawks were chasing insects in the dark air, Jocelyn. Bullfrogs were croaking in the creek bottoms. We got that, don't we? A bird called, "Whip, whip! Whip, poor whip! Hoo-hoo! 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 Hoo-hoo!" said an owl. Far away, the wolves howled and Jack was growling. The wolves were following the herds, Pa said. "Tomorrow, I'll build a strong, high yard for the cow that wolves can't get into." Right, Jocelyn? So they all went into the house with the beef. Pa and Ma and Mary and Laura all agreed to give the milk to baby Carrie. Aww. They watched her drink it. The tin cup hit her face, but Laura could see the gulps of milk going down her throat. Gulp by gulp, she swallowed all that good milk, and then she licked the foam from her lip with her red tongue and laughed. It seemed such a long time before the cornbread and the sizzling beef steaks were done, but nothing had ever tasted so good as that tough, juicy beef. And everyone was happy because now there would be milk to drink and perhaps even butter for the cornbread. The lowing of the cattle herds was far away again, and the songs of the cowboys were almost too faint to be heard. All those cattle were on the other side of the creek bottoms now in Kansas. Tomorrow they would slowly go further on their long way forward to Fort Dodge, where the shoulders were. And that is chapter 13. So we get to open up another part of the house, number 13. And in this part, we have another card and another little dollhouse book. And on the card it says, "What must be done is best done cheerfully." Laura Ingalls Wilder. And this is by another part of the Little House series, the next book, By the Shores of Silver Lake. And you got all the illustrations in there. And By the Shores of Silver Lake was written in 1939 by Laura Ingalls Wilder, and it spans over 1 year, beginning when Laura is 12 years old and her family moves from the Plum Creek, Minnesota, to what will become DeSmet, South Dakota. So that is what happens in By the Shores of Silver Lake. So that is part 13 of the house, and we have 2 more chapters to read. So let us begin with chapter 14, Indian Camp. So day after day was hotter than the day before. The wind was hot, as if it came out of an oven. Ma said. The grass was turning yellow, and the whole world was rippling green and gold under the blazing sky. At noon, the wind died. No birds sang. Everything was so still that Laura could hear the squirrels chattering in the trees down by the creek. Suddenly, black crows flew overhead, calling their raw, sharp caws. Then everything was still again. Ma said that this was midsummer. Pa wondered where the Indians had gone. He said that they had left their little camp on the prairie, and one day he asked Laura and Mary if they would like to see that camp. Laura jumped up and down and clapped her hands, but Ma objected. "It is so far, Charles," she said, "and in this heat?" Pa's blue eyes twinkled. "This heat doesn't hurt the Indians, and it won't hurt us," he said. "Come on, girls." "Please, can't Jack come too?" Laura begged. Pa had taken his gun, but he looked at Laura and he looked at Jack, and then he looked at Ma, and he put the gun up on his pegs again. "All right, Laura," he said, "I'll take Jack. Caroline, and leave you the gun." Jack jumped around them, wagging his stump of a tail, Jocelyn, and as soon as he saw which way they were going, he set off trotting ahead. Pa came next, and behind him came Mary, and then Laura. Mary kept her sunbonnet on, but Laura let her dangles down her back. Ooh, my hair's a mess. The ground was hot under their bare feet. The sunshine pierced through their faded dresses and tingled on their arms and backs. The air was really as hot as the air in an oven, and it smelled faintly like baking bread, Jocelyn. Pa said the smell came from all the grass seeds perching in the heat. They went further and further into the vast prairie. Laura felt smaller and smaller. Even Pa did not seem as big as he really was. At last, they went down into the little hollow where the Indians had camped. Jack started up and started up a big rabbit. And when he bounded out of the grass, Laura jumped. Pa said quickly, "Let him go, Jack. We have meat enough." So Jack sat down and watched the big rabbit go pounding away down the hollow. Laura and Mary looked around them. They stayed close to Pa. Low bushes grew on the sides of the hollow. Buckbrush with strays of berries faintly pink, and sumac holding up green cones, showing here and there a bright red leaf. The goldenrod's plums were turning gray, and the ox-eye daisy's yellow petals hung down from the crown's centers. All this was hidden in the secret little hollow. From the house, Laura had seen nothing but grasses, and now from this hollow she could not see the house. The prairie seemed to be level, but it was not leveled. Laura asked Pa if there was lots of hollows on the prairie like this one, and he said there were. "Are Indians in them?" she almost whispered. He said he didn't know. There might be. She held tight to his hand, and Mary held to his other hand, and they looked at the Indians' camp. There were ashes where Indian campfires had been, and there were holes in the ground where tent poles had been driven. Bones were scattered where Indian logs had gnawed them. All along the sides of the hollow, Indian ponies had bitten the grasses short. Tracks of big moccasins and smaller moccasins were everywhere, and tracks of little bare toes. And over those tracks were tracks of rabbits and tracks of birds and wolf's tracks. Pa read the tracks for Mary and Laura. He showed them tracks of 2 middle-sized moccasins by the edge of the camp's fire ashes. An Indian woman had squatted there. She wore a leather skirt with fringes. The tiny marks of the fringe were in the dust. The track of her toes inside the moccasins, I know, Jocelyn, was deeper than the track of her heels because she had leaned forward to stir something cooking in a pot on the fire. Then Pa picked up a smoke-blackened fork stick, and he said that the pot had hung from a stick laid across the top of 2 upright fork sticks. He showed Mary and Laura the holes where the fork sticks had been driven into the crown. And then he told them to look at the bones around the campfire and tell him what had cooked in that pot. They looked and they said rabbit. That was right, the bones were rabbit's bones. Suddenly Laura shouted, "Look! Look!" Something bright blue glittered in the dust. She picked it up. It was a beautiful blue bead. Laura shouted with joy. Then Mary saw a red one, and Laura saw a green one, and they forgot everything but beads. Pa helped them look. They found white beads and brown beads and more red and blue beads. All that afternoon they hunted for beads in the dust of the Indian camp. Now and then Pa walked up to the edge of the hollow and looked toward home, and then he came back and helped to hunt for more beads. They looked all over the ground carefully, and when they couldn't find any more, it was almost sunset, and Laura had a handful of beads, and so did Mary. And Pa tied them carefully to his handkerchief. Laura's beads in one corner and Mary's in another corner. He put the handkerchief in his pocket, and they started home. The sun was low behind their backs when they came out of the hollow. Home was small and very far away, and Pa did not have his gun. Pa walked so swiftly that Laura could hardly keep up. She trotted as fast as she could, but the sun sank faster. Home seemed further and further away. The prairie seemed larger, and a wind ran over it, whispering something frightening. All the grasses shook as if they were scared. Then Pa turned around, and his blue eyes twinkled at Laura. He said, "Getting tired, little half-pint? It's a long way for little legs." He picked her up, big girl that she was, and he settled her safe against his shoulder. He took Mary by the hand, and so they all came home together. Supper was cooking on the fire, and Ma was setting the table, and baby Carrie played with little pieces of wood on the floor. Pa tossed the handkerchief to Ma. "I'm later than I meant, Caroline," he said, "but look what the girls found." He took the milk bucket and went quickly to bring Pet and Patty from their picket lines to milk the cow. And Ma untied the handkerchief and explained what she found. The beads were even prettier than they had been at the Indian camp. Laura stirred her beads with her finger and watched them sparkle and shine. "These are mine," she said. Then Mary said, "Carrie can have mine." Ma waited to hear what Laura would say. Laura didn't want to say anything. She wanted to keep those pretty beads. Her chest felt all hot inside, and she wished with all her might that Mary wouldn't always be such a good little girl. But she couldn't let Mary be better than she was. So she said slowly, "Carrie can have mine too." "That's my unselfish good little girls," said Ma. She poured Mary's beads into Mary's hands and Laura's into Laura's hands. And she said she would give them a string of thread to put them on. The beads would make a pretty necklace for Carrie to wear around her neck. Mary and Laura sat side by side on their bed, and they strung those pretty beads on a thread that Ma gave them. Each wet her end of the thread in her mouth and twisted it tightly. And then Mary put her end of the thread through the small hole in each of the beads, and Laura put her end through her beads one by one. They didn't say anything. Perhaps Mary felt sweet and good inside, but Laura didn't. When she looked at Mary, she wanted to slap her, so she dared not look at Mary again. The beads made a beautiful string. Carrie clapped her hands and laughed when she saw it. When Ma tied it around Carrie's little neck and it glittered there, Laura felt a little bit better. After all, her beads were not enough beads to make a whole string, and neither were Mary's. But together they made a whole string of beads for Carrie. When Carrie felt the beads on her neck, she grabbed them. She was so little that she did not know any better than to break the string. So Ma untied it and she put the beads away until Carrie should be old enough to wear them. And after that, Laura thought of those pretty beads, and she was still naughty enough to want her beads for herself. But it had been a wonderful day, and she could always think about that long walk across the prairie and about all they had seen in the Indian camp. And that is chapter 13. All right. No, that was chapter 14. Sorry about that. We actually have only one more chapter to read today, chapter 15. But let's open up Parts of the Little House, number 14. And in this one, we have a card and another little dollhouse book. In the card, it says, "There's no great loss without some small gain." Laura Ingalls Wilder. And in this one, we have the dollhouse book, The Long Winter, the next in the Little House series. And it includes all those illustrations from the book. And it is written in 1940. It is set in the southeastern Dakota Territory during the severe winter of 1880 and 1881. And it was when Laura had turned 14 years old, the long winter. And that's what was in part number 14. All right, we have one more chapter to read today, and it is called Fever and Aggie. Ooh, let's find out what happens. Now, blackberries were ripe, and in the hot afternoons, Laura went with Ma to pick them. The big, black, juicy berries hung thick in the barrier patches in the creek bottoms. Some were in the shade of trees, and some were in the sun. But the sun was so hot that Laura and Ma stayed in the shade. There were plenty of berries. Deer lay in the shady groves and watched Ma and Laura. Blue jays flew at their sunbonnets and squalled because they were taking the berries. Snakes hurriedly crawled away from them, and in the trees the squirrels woke up and chattered at them. However, they went among the scratchy barriers, mosquitoes rose up in buzzing swarms. Mosquitoes were thick on the big ripe berries, sucking the sweet juice. But they liked to bite Laura and Ma as much as they liked to eat blackberries. Laura's fingers and her mouth were purple-black with berry juice. Her face and her hands and her bare feet were covered with barrier patches and mosquito bites, Jocelyn. And they were spattered with purple stains too, where she had slapped at the mosquitoes. But every day they brought home pails full of berries, and Ma spread them in the sun to dry. Every day they ate all the blackberries they wanted, and the next winter they would have dry blackberries to stew. I know. Mary hardly ever went to pick blackberries. She stayed in the house to mind baby Carrie because she was older. In the daytime, there were only one or two mosquitoes in the house. But at night, if the wind wasn't blowing hard, mosquitoes came in thick swarms. On still nights, Pa kept piles of damp grass burning all around the house and stable. The damp grass made a smudge of smoke to keep the mosquitoes away, but a good many mosquitoes came anyway. Pa could not play his fiddle in the evenings because so many mosquitoes bit him. Mr. Edwards did not come visiting after supper anymore because the mosquitoes were so thick in the bottoms. All night, Pet and Patty and the coat and the calf and the cow were stamping and swashing their tails in the stable, and in the morning, Laura's forehead was speckled with mosquito bites. "This won't last long," Pa said. "Fall's not far away, and the first cold wind will settle 'em." Laura did not feel very well one day. She felt cold even in the hot sunshine, and she could not get warm by the fire. Ma asked why she and Mary did not go out to play, and Laura said she didn't feel like playing. She was tired and she ached. Ma stopped her work and asked, "Where do you ache?" Laura didn't exactly know. She just said, "I just ache. My legs ache." "I ache too," Mary said. Ma looked at them and said they looked healthy enough, but she said something must be wrong or they wouldn't be so quiet. She pulled up Laura's skirts and petticoats to see where their legs ached, and suddenly Laura shivered all over. She shivered so that her teeth rattled in her mouth. Ma put her hand against Laura's cheek. "You can't be cold," she said. "Your face is hot as fire." Laura felt like crying, but of course she didn't. Only little babies cried. "I'm hot now," she said, "and my back aches." Ma called Pa, and he came in. "Charles, do look at the girls," she said. "I do believe they are sick." "Well, I don't feel any too well myself," said Pa. "First I'm hot, and then I'm cold, and I ache all over. Is that the way you feel, girls? Do your very bones ache?" Mary and Laura said that was the way they felt, Jocelyn. And then Ma and Pa looked a long time at each other, and Ma said, "The place for you girls is bed." It was so queer to be put to bed in daytime, and Laura was so hot that everything seemed wavering. She held on to Ma's neck, and Ma was undressing her, and she begged Ma to tell her what was wrong with her. "You will be all right. Don't worry," Ma said cheerfully. Laura crawled into bed, and Ma tucked her in. It felt good to be in bed. Ma smoothed her forehead with her cool, soft hand and said, "There now, go to sleep." Laura did not exactly go to sleep, but she didn't really wake up again for a long, long time. Strange things seemed to keep happening in a haze. She would see Pa crouching by the fire in the middle of the night, then suddenly sunshine hurt her eyes, and Ma fed her broth from a spoon. Something dwindled slowly, smaller and smaller, till it was thinner than the tiniest thing. Then slowly it swelled till it was larger than anything could be. Two voices jabbered faster and faster, and then a slow voice, drawn more slowly than Laura could bear. There were no words, only voices. Mary was hot in the bed beside her. Mary threw off the covers, and Laura cried because she was so cold. Then she was burning up, and Pa's hand shook the cup of water. Water spilled down her neck. The tin cup rattled against her teeth until she could hardly drink. Then Ma tucked in the covers and Ma's hand burned against Laura's cheek. She heard Pa say, "Go to bed, Caroline." Ma said, "You're sicker than I am, Charles." Laura opened her eyes and saw bright sunshine. Mary was sobbing. "I want a drink of water! I want a drink of water! I want a drink of water!" Jack went back and forth between the big bed and the little bed. Laura saw Pa lying on the floor by the big bed. Jack pawed at Pa and whined. He took off Pa's sleeve with his teeth and shook it. Pa's head lifted up a little and he said, "I must get up, I must. Caroline and the girls." Then his head fell back and he laid down still. Jack lifted up his nose and howled. Laura tried to get up, but she was too tired. Then she saw Ma's red face looking over the edge of the bed. Mary was all the time crying for water. Ma looked at Mary, and then she looked at Laura, and she whispered, "Laura, can you?" "Yes, Ma," Laura said. This time she got out of bed, and when she tried to stand up, the floor rocked and she fell down. Jack's tongue lapped and lapped at her face, and he quivered and whined, but he stood still and firm. When she took a hold of him and sat up against him, she knew she must get water to stop Mary's crying, and she did. She crawled all the way across the floor to the water bucket. There was only a little water in it. She shook so with cold that she could hardly get hold of the dipper. But she did get hold of it. She dipped up some water, and she sat up across that enormous floor again. Jack stayed beside her all the way. Mary's eyes didn't open, Jocelyn. Her hands held onto the dipper, and her mouth swallowed all the water out of it. And then she stopped crying. The dipper fell to the floor, and Laura crawled under the covers. It was a long time before she began to get warm again. Sometimes she heard Jack sobbing. Sometimes she howled. He howled, and she thought he was a wolf. But she was not afraid. She laid burning up and hearing him howl. She heard voices jabbering again, and the slow voice drawing, and she opened her eyes and saw a big black face close above her face. It was coal black and shiny. Its eyes were black and soft. Its teeth shone white in a thick, big mouth. This face smiled, and a deep voice said softly, "Drink this, little girl." An arm lifted under her shoulders, and a black hand held a cup to her mouth. Laura swallowed a bitter swallow and tried to turn her head away, but the cup followed her mouth. The mellow, deep voice said again, "Drink it. It will make you well." So Laura swallowed the whole bitter dose. When she woke up, a fat woman was stirring the fire, and Laura looked at her carefully. And she was not black. She was tanned like Ma. "I want a drink of water, please," Laura said. The fat woman brought it to her at once. The good, cold water made Laura feel better. She looked at Mary asleep beside her. She looked at Pa and Ma asleep in the big bed. Jack laid half asleep on the floor. Laura looked again at the fat woman and asked, "Who are you?" "I'm Mrs. Scott," the woman said, smiling. "There now, you feel better, don't you?" "Yes, thank you," Laura said politely. The fat woman brought her a cup of hot prairie chicken broth. "Drink it all up like a good little girl," she said. Laura drank up every drop of the good broth. "Now go to sleep," said Mrs. Scott. "I'm here to take care of everything till you're all well." Next morning, Laura felt so much better that she wanted to get up, but Mrs. Scott said she must stay in bed until the doctor came. She laid and watched Mrs. Scott tidy the house and give medicine to Pa and Ma and Mary. Then it was Laura's turn. She opened her mouth, and Mrs. Scott poured a dreadful bitterness out of a small folded paper onto Laura's tongue. Laura drank water and swallowed and drank again. She could swallow the powder, but she couldn't swallow the bitterness. Then the doctor came, and he was the black man. Laura had never seen a black man before, and she could not take her eyes off Dr. Tan. He was so very black, and she would have been afraid of him if she had not liked him so much. He smiled at her with all his white teeth. He talked to Ma and Pa and left a rolling, jawling laugh. Then all wanted him to stay longer, but he had to hurry away. Mrs. Scott said that all the settlers up and down the creek had fever or Aggie. There was not enough well people to take care of the sick, and she had been going from house to house, working day and night. "It's a wonder you ever lived through," she said. "All of you down at once. What might have happened if Dr. Tan hadn't found them?" She didn't know. Dr. Tan was a doctor with the Indians. He was on his way north to Independence when he came to Pa's house. It was a strange thing that Jack, who hated strangers and never let one come near the house until Pa or Ma told him to, had gone to greet and meet Dr. Tan and begged him to come in. "And here you all are, more dead than alive," Mrs. Scott said. Dr. Tan had stayed with them a day and a night before Mrs. Scott came, and now he was doctoring all the sick settlers. Mrs. Scott said that all this sickness came from eating watermelons. She said, "I've said 1,100 times, if I have once, that watermelons." "What's that?" Pa exclaimed. "Who's got watermelons?" Mrs. Scott said that one of the settlers had planted watermelons in the creek bottoms, and every soul who had eaten one of those melons had done sick that very minute. She said that she had warned them, but no, she said, there was no arguing with them. They would eat those melons, and now they're paying for it. "I haven't tasted a good slice of watermelon since Hector was a pup," said Pa. The next day he was out of bed. The next day Laura was up. Then Ma got up, and then Mary. They were all thin and shaky, but they could take care of themselves, so Mrs. Scott went home. Ma said she didn't know how they could ever thank her. And Mrs. Scott said, "Psh, what are neighbors for but to help each other out?" Pa's cheeks were hollow, and he walked slowly. Ma often sat down to rest. Laura and Mary didn't feel like playing. Every morning they all took their bitter powders, but Ma still smiled her lovely smile, and Pa whistled cheerfully. "It's an ill wind that doesn't blow some good," he said. He wasn't able to work, so he could make a rocking chair for Ma. He brought some slender willows from the creek bottoms, and he made the chair in the house. He could stop any time to put wood on the fire or lift a kettle for Ma. First he made 4 stout legs and braced them firmly with cross pieces. And then he cut thin strips of towel willow skin just under the bark. He wove those strips back and forth, under and over, till they made a seat for the chair. He split a long, straight sapling down the middle. He begged one end of the half of it to the side of the seat, and he curved it up and over and down, and pegged the other end to the other side of the seat. That made a high curved back for the chair. He braced it firmly, and then he wove the thin willow strips across and up and down, under and over each other, till they filled in the chair back. With the other half of the split sapling, Pa made arms for the chair. He curved from there in the front of the seat to the chair back, and he filled them in with woven strips. Last of all, he split a larger willow which had grown in a curve. He turned the chair upside down, and he pegged the curved pieces to its legs to make the rockers, and the chair was done. Then they made a celebration. Ma took off her apron and smoothed her smooth brown hair. She pinned her gold pin in front of her collar. Ma tied the string of beads around Carrie's neck. Pa and Laura made Mary's pillow on a chair seat and sat Laura's pillow against its back. Over the pillows, Pa spread the quilt from the little bed, and then he took Ma's hand and led her to the chair, and he put baby Carrie in her arms. Ma leaned back into the softness. Her thin cheeks flushed, and her eyes sparkled with tears, but her smile was beautiful. The chair rocked her gently, and she said, "Oh, Charles, I haven't been so comfortable since I don't know when." so she wasn't as much comfortable in the bed. Then Pa took his fiddle and he played and sang to Ma in the firelight. Ma rocked and baby Carrie went to sleep, and Mary and Laura sat on their bench and were happy. The very next day, without saying where he was going, Pa rode away on Patty. Ma wondered and wondered where he had gone, and when Pa came back, he was balancing a watermelon in front of him on the saddle. He could hardly carry it into the house. He let it fall on the floor and dropped down beside it. "I thought I'd never get here," he said. "It must weigh 40 pounds, and I'm as weak as water. Hand me the butcher knife." "But Charles," Ma said, "you mustn't. Mrs. Scott said." Pa laughed his big, pealing laugh again. "But that's not reasonable," he said. "This is a good melon. Why should it have fever Aggie? Everyone knows that fever Aggie comes from breathing the night air." "This watermelon grew in the night air," said Pa. "Nonsense," Pa said. "Give me the butcher knife. I'll eat this melon if I knew it would give me chills and fever." I do believe you would," said Ma, handing him the knife. It went into the melon with a luscious sound. The green rind split open, and there was the bright red inside, flecked with black seeds. The red heart actually looked frosty. Nothing had ever been so tempting as that watermelon on that hot day. Ma would not taste it. She would not let Laura and Mary eat one bite. But Pa ate slice after slice after slice until at last he sighed and said the cow could have the rest of it. Next day he had a little chill and a little fever. Ma blamed the watermelon. But next day she had a chill and a little fever. So they did not know what could have caused their fever of algae. No one knew. In those days, that fever algae was malaria, and that some mosquitoes give it to the people when they bite them. And that is chapter 15. Next week, we're going to go into having something happen to the chimney. So that'll be exciting. And on that note, we're going to open the chimney of the little house. And it's number 15. And in here, we have another special something that is going to happen in that scene that I love in this book that we'll get to later. And it says, "Home is where the heart is." And it comes with a heart cookie. And that is going to be something very special that's going to come later in a scene that I love in the Little House on the Prairie. And on that note, we will see you next week for another 5 chapters of Little House on the Prairie with Storytime with Jocelyn. And I'm going to leave you again with the quote from the chimney. "Home is where the heart is." Right, Jocelyn? Bye-bye.